This week, a pop-up ad for a t-shirt on my Facebook account had this slogan on the shirt: "I'm not arguing, I'm just explaining why I'm right." That's a very appropriate comment for our times, because it seems to me that many people are not really interested in an honest back and forth discussion. They're more interested in simply explaining why they're right and I'm wrong. Actor Alan Alda once said, "Listening is a willingness to let the other person change you." Listening involves actually hearing what the other person's saying and being open to the possibility that we could learn some things. We could understand what's going on in their lives, in their hearts, and in their souls. But do we really listen anymore? This is nothing new. A Jewish lawyer came up to Jesus and he knows that he's right. He's not going to argue. He's just going to explain his position. He's trying to trick Jesus. "Teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" He knows his answer. He's not honestly asking Jesus his opinion. He's not open to listening. He wants to smack Jesus down. And Jesus wisely avoids a confrontation. He answers the question with a question. What do the scriptures say? And the man, I imagine a little bit perturbed, shoots back, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself." And Jesus replies, "You're right. Do this and you will live." And he turns to walk away. The lawyer is annoyed. There's a good crowd on hand to watch him with the equivalent of a Harvard legal education, destroy Jesus. He's there to prove that he's right and Jesus is wrong. So we read that in order to justify himself, he calls out after Jesus. That's all very well, but who is my neighbor? Jesus stops. He looks closely at the man. The crowd goes very silent, waiting for the fireworks to begin. Maybe now the lawyer can prove that he is right once and for all. Because the question was an important one then, and it's an important one now. For the lawyer, as for all the Jews standing there, the answer was clear. The Jews were God's chosen people. So their neighbor was their Jewish neighbor. They were surrounded by and infiltrated by non-Jews. They were the Romans. They were the Samaritans, who were half-breeds, half-Jewish, half-non-Jews. Jews were to have no dealings with foreigners. They were to have nothing to do with Samaritans. Jesus has been socializing with all kinds of people, including non-Jews. And so now, when the lawyer asks, "Who is my neighbor?" he is setting Jesus up. Would Jesus say the right thing? They knew they had to love God and love their neighbor, but that meant their Jewish neighbor. Today, we know we need to love God. We know, I hope, that God desires us to love our neighbor. But who is our neighbor? Our neighbor who is just like us? Our neighbor who just lives on the same street as us? Our neighbor who is First Nations? Our neighbor who is Muslim? Our neighbor who has a different lifestyle than we do? Who is my neighbor? It's one of those crucial ethical questions of all time. If my neighbor is only close acquaintances and family members, I'm fine with that. If my neighbor is people just like me, I'm okay with that. If it's people in my immediate geographical neighborhood, I'm probably okay with that, but that's stretching me a little bit. But if my neighbor includes people who are not like me, I'm not so sure I'm comfortable with that. And as the crowd hushes to hear Jesus answer, Jesus calmly sits down and begins to speak. He doesn't argue. He doesn't explain why he's right. Instead, he tells a story. Hannah read the story that Jesus told just a couple of minutes ago. In it, Jesus introduces us to 5 people. The first is the victim, the innocent victim. He could be any of those listening to Jesus as he's talking. He could be you or I. Now, Jesus could make the case that he wasn't too bright. He was walking a dangerous road all by himself, but that's not Jesus' point. Then there are the thieves. And again, Jesus doesn't spend much time on them. He thinks we can figure out for ourselves that we're not to be that kind of person. Oh, they may have had their reasons, their children were hungry, whatever. But Jesus hopes that we can determine that this is not the kind of person we ought to be. Then there are 2 people we can lump together, the priest and the Levite. These were both religious people, just slightly different ranks in the temple system. Like the lawyer questioning Jesus, they both know their Old Testaments very well. They would have debated the question, who is my neighbor? And they wouldn't need to argue about it anymore because they know that they are right. They know exactly who their neighbor is. However, when they see their Jewish compatriot lying in the ditch, they walk over and to the other side and simply pass by. Who is their neighbor? Clearly not this guy who's injured. Jesus gives us no insight into why they did what they did. He leaves it for us to come up with excuses for them. Why do you think they passed by? Are they frightened? Worried that the robbers will come again? Do they simply not care? Are they just too busy? They have too many things to do? Do they feel they have nothing to offer? They don't know the man. If they'd known him, maybe they would have stopped. What do you think? Jesus forces us to fill in the blanks and to kind of put ourselves in their shoes and ask ourselves, would we have stopped? Why? Or why not? Fourth, we have the innkeeper. He does help the injured traveler because he's asked to and he's going to be paid for it. But he does take a bit of a risk. He trusts that the Samaritan will actually come back and will pay the bill. And finally, we have the Samaritan. This is a surprise to Jesus' audience because Samaritans were despised outsiders. They were nobodies. Jews were to have nothing to do with Samaritans. Who is my neighbor does not include Samaritans at all. No Jew would ever help a Samaritan. The legal expert knows a Samaritan is not a neighbor. And yet, in a shocking twist, this Samaritan is the one who helps the Jewish man. Jesus carefully understates the extent of the Samaritan's efforts. His help is significant, but it's not overwhelming. He offers basic, common sense first aid. He delays his journey long enough to help. He exposes himself to the possibility of attack from the same bandits, and he incurs some financial obligation. But the Samaritan is not Superman. He does not do orthopedic surgery on the roadside. He does not take the victim back to his home and nurse him back to health. He does not obligate himself to support the victim for the rest of his life. As Jesus tells the story, the Samaritan simply feels compassion, feels mercy. The Greek word Jesus uses actually means he feels spleeny. He feels it in his spleen. He was deeply moved. He felt sorry for him in his guts. And then he does ordinary, common sense, good things, expecting no reward, just doing the right thing at the right time. That's the story. So what does the story mean? Well, Jesus gives us the key. The lawyer is concerned with drawing a circle around who is my neighbor. He wants to know who he can exclude, basically. And Jesus, at the end of the parable, asks the lawyer a very pointed question. Who was the neighbor to the man who fell among thieves? Who proved to be the neighbor to the one who fell among thieves. And the lawyer squirms for a moment or two because he cannot actually bring himself to say the Samaritan. And so he says, rather obtusely, the one who showed mercy. And Jesus says to him, yes, now go and do the same. Jesus' point? Neighborliness is not about a group of people that we can draw a circle around saying, these people are my neighbors and those people are not my neighbors. Neighborliness is an attitude we have toward everyone, toward anyone who has a need. It's a way of going about day-to-day life with a neighborly eye and recognizing that whether it's a family member or the clerk at Superstore or someone we're just passing by in the next car on the road, that person may be having a difficult time. And we can pray for them. We can care for them. We can encourage them. We can bless them. It's a way of being at work, at school, in our condo or lodge and seeing those in need. It's a way of being church and seeing those who struggle. It's a way of seeing the world and living your life. It's a matter of just doing the right thing. Ordinary, everyday, common sense things that can make life a little bit lighter, a little bit brighter, a little bit better for the people around us. We can be neighborly simply as we walk through our lives. In 1 John chapter 4, John writes, "Dear friends, let us continue to love one another, for love comes from God. Anyone who loves is a child of God and knows God. But anyone who does not love does not know God, for God is love. God showed how much he loved us by sending his one and only Son into the world so that we might have eternal life through him. Dear friends, since God loved us that much, we surely ought to love one another." If we love God, we're to love one another, whoever the one another is. We're not thugs who rob and destroy. Few of us here, I hope, have a problem with robbery. But sometimes it's possible to steal more than material possessions. Do we ever steal someone's good name or reputation by spreading gossip, by feeling animosity towards them, or by treating them poorly? Do we ever steal someone else's joy or peace through posting or reposting nasty social media comments? Jesus also speaks about the subtle attitude of avoidance. The religious men did nothing wrong. They didn't do anything bad. They simply didn't do anything right. Simply being not a bad person isn't enough. Jesus wants us to actively be good people, to do good things. An old adage says, all it takes for evil to triumph is for good people to do nothing. Jesus doesn't want us simply to be not bad people. He wants us to be good people. Jesus wants us to know that each of us can make a difference in our world. No matter who we are, we can make the world better for even just one person. We may be quite ordinary. It doesn't really matter. We don't have to be Superman or Wonder Woman. God has given each of us gifts, skills, resources, abilities, experiences that we can use in ordinary, common sense ways to be a blessing to the people around us. Individual lives, communities, the world is changed when ordinary people do ordinary, neighborly things. What we do doesn't have to be big. All the Samaritan had going for him was a few minutes, a donkey, a small amount of cash, and a big heart. That's just enough to make all the difference in the world for one other person. We don't have to be anyone special. We just have to use our neighborly eyes, our neighborly common sense, and act neighborly to simply do good things for those around us. This parable was acted out for us in a very practical way a few years ago when we were in Italy. We were renting a cottage way out in the country for a week. On the Thursday of the week, I woke up and I could barely move. I was so nauseous. I kind of crawled to the bathroom. It was awful. That evening, Marianne went over to Giovanni, our landlord, and explained the situation to him, and he looked at me and I looked awful. So he said in broken English, "Let me make a phone call." And that evening at about 8:30, the local Italian GP came by. He did a house call in the middle of rural Italy. And he went over me and in broken English said he thought I had vertigo. And so he gave me a prescription. Giovanni's wife drove 20 minutes into Certaldo and back with the prescription that evening. The GP wouldn't take any money because that was just part of his job. Friday morning, Giovanni's GP arrived before office hours because Giovanni didn't really like the GP who came the night before. And Giovanni's GP went over me and again thought it was vertigo. And I asked him what we owed him, and he said nothing. He said, "You're Giovanni's friend, I'm Giovanni's friend. Friends don't charge friends money." And we said, "We really aren't Giovanni's friend. We're just renting his cottage for a week." But there it was. Anyway, he thought we should see a ear, nose, throat specialist in Siena, about a 45-minute drive on windy, twisty country roads away. And I explained that there was no way that I could drive to Siena. Marianne wasn't insured on the car, so how would we get there? "Well," he said, "let me make a phone call." So he made a phone call. And he came back and said that the ear, nose, throat specialist would be here at this little cottage in the country in Italy at 4:30 that afternoon. And sure enough, the specialist drove 45 minutes from Siena, spent an hour going over me, and in broken English explained that she did think it was vertigo as well. She wrote up a one-page report in Italian and a one-page report, which took a lot of effort, in English as well. It was amazing what Giovanni, 2 different GPs, and an ear, nose, throat specialist did for us. They didn't have to, but they did it because it was simply the right thing to do. I felt a lot like that person who was lying in the ditch. And these were our Good Samaritans. Imagine the next chapter in the story of the Good Samaritan, the chapter that Jesus doesn't give us. It's a few days later, and we're back at that inn. And the man who was severely beaten is doing pretty well now. He's pretty much recovered. And so he's invited all his friends down from Jerusalem for a big party to celebrate his recovery. At dinner, he stands to make a few remarks, and he retells the story. He talks about the harrowing events as he is beaten and robbed. He tells of the hours lying in a ditch, waiting for someone to help. He talks about a priest and a Levite who crossed to the other side of the road and walked by. And he talks about a Samaritan, an outcast, someone no one thought of as a neighbor, who actually took pity on him and cared for him. Imagine various other travelers arriving at the inn. There's a priest and a Levite, 2 very religious people going back up to Jerusalem in order to do their religious duties. And they see the who's who of Jerusalem is here having a big party, and they're excited because this is their crowd. These are the people they belong with. These are their folks. And so they push their way into the banquet room. And as they do, their eyes meet the eyes of the man whom they left for dead. And what are the emotions going through their minds? They had an opportunity to just do something that's so common sense, to just care a little bit. And they didn't take it. There's the nagging regret. There's the guilt. There's the shame. But there's nothing they can do or say now. Their chance is lost once and for all. For whatever reason, these religious people missed their moment. Those reasons now seem pretty petty and pretty unimportant, but they had their chance and they muffed it. Imagine 3 highwaymen coming in, carousing and carrying on, one of them wearing a big gold ring that he stole from a recent mark. They're pretty happy with themselves, and yet everyone in the inn recognizes that ring and knows who they are. Perhaps it's just as well that Jesus doesn't talk about those reunions. He does tell us that a Samaritan promised to stop by on his way back up the road to see what he owed the innkeeper. And so imagine an outsider, a nobody, a Samaritan, a foreigner, who quietly slinks into the back of the inn because he hears the party and he knows he's not welcome. He goes to the desk and humbly says to the innkeeper, "Do you remember who I am? A few days ago I brought in a person who was pretty badly beaten. How's he doing? How much do I owe you?" And the innkeeper smiles but doesn't answer. Instead, he sends his son into the next room. And all of a sudden, there's a cascade of sound as the doors fly open, and the man who was injured and now recovered embraces the Samaritan, gives him a big bear hug, and everybody cheers. The ordinary outcast Samaritan, whom no Jewish lawyer like the one asking Jesus this question would ever consider a neighbor. They're nobodies. He looks into the face of the man he'd met in a ditch a few days earlier. And there is joy, and there is hope, and there is neighborliness. And this is the difference that takes place when Jesus' love flows into our hearts and flows through us to other people, whoever they are. It simply doesn't matter who the other person is. If they have a need and we can meet that need, then we can be neighbor to that person. And that can give us an incredible sense of joy and hope and life and fulfillment. These days, maybe we need to spend a little less time explaining why we're right. Maybe we need a little bit more time spent listening to one another, listening to what the other person is really saying, not about the social issues of the time, but what they're saying about what their needs are, how they're feeling, how they're doing. Maybe when we listen, then we can reach out in love and care. Jesus is asking us to listen. Who is it, he says, who proved to be the neighbor to the man who fell among thieves? You know the answer. I know the answer. The one who shows mercy. Jesus says, now go and do the same.